This is the second half of my conversation with Elijah Parker. We touched on how we can use different forms of language, such as music, to express ourselves, entrainment and the physics of harmony, wounds and wonders, and the nature of vulnerability as honest self-inquiry. And I love the image of us being watery beings moving through seas of vibration. Elijah is a Gene Keys guide, ambassador, and core member of the Gene Keys publishing team. The Gene Keys offer a set of teachings to guide personal growth and development through contemplation, inquiry, gentleness, and patience. Elijah facilitates both personal and group sessions with the Gene Keys for transformation in relationships, activating creative projects, and discovering the gifts inside life's challenges. Here's my conversation with Elijah. Things that just came to mind as you were talking is, it's true that we express so much through words, through language. And I'm with you on language being incredibly powerful and very evocative of cultures and backgrounds. And there's so much in it. And I'm coming to terms with recognizing that there's the limits to language. There's things we can't say. There's things that we say in words that is not what we meant. And there's actually no words for certain kinds of feelings and things. So I was thinking about what you said about collective truth and collective love. And those are words, but I can feel into that. And there's probably a lot that we can feel into that's beyond what the words are. But I wonder if that's also connected to making music. Because music I find absolutely fascinating as a completely different language in a way. And it predates our spoken language. That music is much more fundamental to us. What does it mean to you to be making music?
That's a really good, it was a physiological connection. My particular instrument, you see them behind me, are hand pans. They're these melodic drums. And I trained when I was a kid in drumline and back in Texas and like all the language of that. But more when I found this instrument, what it did is allowed my hands to explore something physical. It was a vibration that was physical, and it tunes us into a physiological experience as opposed to an overly mental one. And of course, you can use the mind in amazing ways, but the best music, I never considered myself a musician until it was something that was natural, not mechanical, if that makes sense. And that is a little bit of what you're saying too, of like music moves our body. And not to discount that there's incredible technicians who can still make moving music, but it helped me understand that actually what I'm looking for is not a goal of expression, but rather tuning into a rhythm of a particular feeling. And for me, it was actually grief. So I had lost someone in my life when I first really was exploring these instruments. And so it was a way, instead of trying to process it through language, because inevitably, when you lose a loved one, there is amazing tools that we need to express and find. But the wellspring of grief that we feel when in loss is not something we can cry dry. This is an ocean of experience. And so it was a physiological modality to experience my waves of grief without having to sell it or have a story about it or package it and make sense of it. And I really think it's important we find some way with our bodies, whether it's dance or creating in the garden or touch with humans, that we remember that we are still these somatic beings and not everything has to be processed through the mind. In fact, like you said, some of it can't be. So I think that's why I'm so fascinated by music, is it has that ability to tune into our cellular body.
It makes me think a bit, because I'm not familiar with the instrument. Everything behind you is a bit blurry, so I
Yeah,
can't,
yeah,
there's like
totally.
round things back there. But there's something super interesting about drums and the vibrations. I guess all instruments make vibrations, but for me, it's more kind of obvious with drums and sound baths and things like that, where there's a lot of, not that there has to be research supporting it, but I think there's a lot behind the science of the vibrations. We create those vibrations with instruments or the sound baths, and your body, you mentioned it earlier, you
Hmm.
start to entrainment, right? So that idea that your body starts to hum along at the same vibration as the drum or instruments like that. And I find that fascinating too. That's almost like a communal truth. That for me is very physical, right? It's a very natural response. And then everybody in the room is all kind of humming at the same at the same vibration. I find that fascinating.
I 100% agree. One of my dearest friends and musicians I play with, he's a harpist, but he's also a physicist. And so, like, he was explaining to me that this isn't a subjective thing. Harmony isn't subjective. It's physics. And when you start to see the patterns, like you said, every instrument creates vibration. There's a body of some kind that resonates in a particular chamber along these fundamental frequency patterns. And when our bodies are humming along with something else that's in harmony, it gives us an invitation to drop into that harmony with it. And I think that's what, as humans, we have to learn how to do without just music, because we can only listen to music for, we also have to grow food and raise our children and pay taxes and all these things. But we are also instruments. We resonate at those frequencies. And when I have the honesty to look at the patterns of when I do that thing, am I really singing out with harmony or am I putting that, and not that dissonance is wrong, but I'm putting a particular collapsed frequency out into the words. So I use those stabbing words to my wife because I'm grumpy. I've now injected that into our collective space. And not that I have to be happy and perfect all the time, but if I breathe and relax into a resonance of, you know what, I'm scared. I don't know what's going to come of our family in this next cycle, but I'm going to choose, for me, the words are loving kindness. It helps me tune into a physiological frequency of, I can choose to still be kind in this moment, even though I'm angry, even though I'm scared, even though I need something. And I'm entraining myself to a vibration that feels harmonious. And I think that's a really powerful technique that we as humans need to tune into that skill set a little bit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one of the things that Gene Key does really well is even the step before that. So the step before trying to be more conscious of putting out maybe better frequencies is, what am I feeling?
Yeah.
And that is a case where again it's a little bit tricky because there's not always words, but there's some words. And like words can help you dig down at least enough far to the feeling to be able to be much more aware. Like that's a super vulnerable thing, I think, is to just be self-aware. Like what is actually going on inside here? That's something that I think a lot of us kind of tamp down. I just can't cope because if I spend too much time, navel gazing, I'm not paying taxes and I'm not feeding my kids and I'm not, working at whatever it is I'm supposed to be working at. But what I love about the Gene Keys, I think, is it gives a beginnings to language to frame what I'm feeling, and then I can say, okay, what can I do with those feelings? Whether I'm aware of them or not, they're happening, and that frequency is going out. So I have to become aware of them to be responsible in a way for how they are then impacting the others in my community. It's a lot of work,
It,
Elijah.
it is like as you're saying it, I'm like, yeah, I don't want to sign up for that. That sounds like a lot. And I think that's kind of the joke, right? Is that we are one. I think it's really nice that you said that. If we're already putting out those frequencies, is one way to say it. The other, we're already sick, right? Like we're recognizing some places that we haven't really spent time to honor. That's where I'm wounded. That's where I'm hurt. That's where I'm sick. That's where I'm stuck. And it is a lot easier to drown it with something external or move on to the next thing. And that is part of our collective work right now. And it is hard work, and I really don't devalue that. It's been probably the you asked a question before we came on in the invitation of just like what are the risks of doing personal transformation work, and I've been sitting with that, and it's like, well, part of it is that it feels endless. Like there's another layer of myself to discover, and it's like, man, I kind of miss my ignorance is bliss moment of self-awareness can feel like an eternal purgatory sometimes of like, there it is again. But the opposite is still true, and that's why I love the Gene Keys is it provides a bit of myth, it provides a bit of play, it provides a bit of superpowers to remember that there's equally energy being released. So while it's terrifying sometimes to slow down long enough to actually, okay, belly, what I'm freaking out. What am I feeling? What is going on inside my system? And some days it means I take a 5 minute break, I stop work, and I literally kind of curl up in bed. And I'm just like, I feel sick. I don't know what to do. I'm terrified of every decision I could possibly make. And I just give myself to allow to feel what is happening in my body, not try to fix it actually, just feel what's happening in my body. And from that, energy starts to emerge. It may not happen instantly. It usually doesn't, especially at the beginning. It's not so quick to like have a revelation. But over time, I've seen more and more that I know my now I've convinced myself after over time that I see breakthroughs that occur. Sometimes they're a day later, sometimes they're a month later, sometimes they're years later, like long cycles that take time. But the breakthroughs are so revelatory and enjoyable and ecstatic, even. I have lost, and like death is a big teacher for me. I would never want the people who have died in my life to have left the way they did or to like, but the level of love that it's taught me how to be as a human being is a gift. It genuinely is a gift. And that's not to take away from pain, but it's recognizing that pain comes with grace, that pain comes with energy. And so it is hard work, and it's also incredibly rewarding. And that's this like risk reward situation with personal transformation is sorry, it's going to take up a lot of time, especially when it's a newer muscle. But now I'm really grateful. I'm dealing with emails all day. I'm jumping on this call. I'm doing my next thing. And I can feel when something gets stuck because I've been listening to my body. And it's like, ooh, I need to put my feet down even while I'm writing an email, like breathe into my feet. It doesn't have to feel so separate. I think that sometimes we think it's a whole thing I've got to go through to feel myself. And actually, it can be as simple as putting a hand on my body for a second and just feel what's emerging and allowing and accepting. And then eventually, over time, we embrace the brilliance of feeling our wounds. Because they're not just wounds, they're wonders. They're wound up energy waiting to release an intelligent new decision, a creative new step. So, I just want to say thank you. Like today, here's my vulnerability. Like, I've been tired and I've been feeling this particular thing I'm working on separately in my own personal life, and I could feel it like aching. And I was sitting here before coming onto this call, and it was just like, and even rereading your questions and inquiry, asking those questions inside myself, I found that reservoir of incredible passion and energy and love. And that's where I've learned is that as hard as it can get, there is always more love to give. There might be changes I need to make in my relationship. You can't give of yourself every day in that way. You can't give to your work in a way that hurts your body. There are boundaries we need to learn. But that love is what I'll call it as a word. That love is actually free and actually overflowing. And that's what I've discovered by the hard work that it is to ask those questions.
That's great, Elijah. And I think, that some of the essence of that is funny when so if I'm trying to compartmentalize and I'm saying, well, I'm going to do my personal work from 9 to 11:30 a.m. and then I'm going to go do my real life, and that somehow it's something separate, that every single moment of our lives is either a teaching or a child. That's what it is. That's the stuff of it. But it's just coming with that awareness of looking at it in that way and saying, "Oh yeah, that's my shadow." Poke, 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 poke. Like that. Why did I? Oh, that just. Why did I suddenly feel that in my heart? That feel, like, oh, where did that come from? And so, integrating all those things in our daily lives as a practice, I guess, is part of it, but beautifully expressed. You reminded me to look at my questions because sometimes I just go off and I don't actually cover all the questions. But I think we've mostly, I mean, I will ask you the kitchen sink question, which
Mm,
is what does vulnerability mean to you?
mm. Vulnerability. I loved how you said earlier it's so deeply vulnerable to look inward and actually ask those questions. And I think that's often I immediately think of vulnerability as, oh, I'm being vulnerable with someone else. I'm showing someone else my raw inner self. But really, vulnerability is an intimacy with my own wounds, my sacred wounds. That's a term we use in the Gene Keys of our wounds aren't just our sins that were broken and messed up because someone messed us up and or we thought that's what love was and we made these mistakes. That's all part of it, but they're also these sacred wounds. They are deep parts of our consciousness that are waiting for us to discover them. So vulnerability for me is an intimacy with my wound patterns. And the more vulnerable I am with myself in that way, the more available I am for others. Now, sometimes that means I pour my heart out in terms of telling you about my wounds. But vulnerability doesn't require that level of transparency. I can be very vulnerable with my coworkers in a way that is not compromising of anyone's personal or professional space because I'm available inside myself. Ooh, I'm getting triggered by the way that that's happening with my coworker. You know, I can be vulnerable with the wound that's coming up for me. And that can express itself actually with very clear boundaries, with like, it can be professional, it can be with family that doesn't communicate with the same language I do. Like, oh, they don't the wounded side is, oh, you don't have any emotional intelligence. You need to learn better nonviolent communication. The gift side of it is I can be open and available to speak with my heart and clear boundaries. So vulnerability doesn't just mean open heart surgery all the time. And, you need to have a healthy respect for yourself. And that's also an honesty. It's like, ooh, I'm really hurt right now. And if I stayed in this room and pretended to be okay, it's not about being vulnerable to the other person and let them know what's going on in my world. I'm not being vulnerable with myself right now. And I think that's that first primary relationship and why I think it's so juicy to be vulnerable. And maybe my cynical side says that people tend to be too vulnerable with each other in the ooey gooey part of reality because sometimes some of that needs to just be processed healthily inside first. So if you find yourself, maybe I would suggest on a broader universal, if you're more on the repressive side, you never share anything. I think that like me, I'm a stoic. I hide things real deep inside, so I have to practice letting go a little bit. And then the opposite, if I'm always processing outside of myself, how vulnerable can I be to have my own back for a little bit and really just feel these feelings inside my own container before they need someone else? And that's always what we're looking at with the Gene Keys is the middle way, right? Sometimes I'm overly repressive, sometimes I'm overly reactive, maybe within minutes of each other, right? But the gift lives in a recognition of those extremes and is discovering vulnerably, honestly, intimately, this is where that's coming from a wound, and this is what that wound is teaching me. That's vulnerability to me, is a willingness and a love to listen to that teaching.
I mean, it's going to be something for me anyway to think about. But I love the idea that if vulnerability is being open to myself, and I agree with you. I don't think being vulnerable means that I got to tell everybody all the stuff that I'm going through because what is that for anyway? It's really for me to be open and aware of what's happening because that does have an impact on others as well as myself. But I've sort of I'm going to think a little bit about what it means to then model vulnerability, because if it's internal, I still think that people
Hmm.
feel that. So if somebody meets you, for example, they'll be like, it's not because Elijah talks to me about everything that's happened to him and all these terrible things, but I somehow know that he is open and aware of himself, and you model that. But it's an anyway. So it's something to think about. But I think there's something really important going on there, because I think a lot of we learn so much from others, and
Hmm.
it's not just what they say and what they do, it's what we feel from them, and being aware of that, like being really open and aware of that, and what you can learn from another person when they're not saying or doing anything. I find that fascinating.
Maybe it's like the entrainment thing that we were talking about too, right? We're holding that vibration, and that's why it's not about I've achieved something, which I do think, you know, was a kind reflection you said of, oh, it's not that I've done all my work and now I get to talk on this. It's actually modeling is also mean I'm participating in the journey. And I think that sometimes we think of states as like, oh, I've attained that state, I've attained that perfection, I've attained that skill set. I've been vulnerable once, so I've attained vulnerability. It's a constant relationship with life, and that's why we actually do feel so much way more than facial features, and it's not, we smell each other, we feel like subtle shifts with each other even in non-local. And I think that that's where being vulnerable with myself is also meaning being honest with myself of what's coming up for me, because sometimes I don't always trust my distrust, right? I'm a very loving person. I genuinely do believe love and compassion is the heart of every human being, and we have the potential for redemption. And that can be a dangerous assumption. And there are these subtle cues that we listen to. It's like, ooh, is that my cultural bias of why I'm afraid of that? Or is that an actual instinctual something is happening and this person's not being honest with me? And so me being vulnerable to both those sides. Ooh, is this a personalized wound? Is this a part of my instinct and intuition coming online? And there'll never be a time when maybe one day we're all enlightened, yay, but in my experience as a human, there's not going to be a time that that's just solid and done, and I know that with 100% accuracy. We're watery beings. We're moving through the sea of vibration together. So I do think it's a constant practice. I don't think it's something that we can just be done with. And when we feel that authenticity of someone, even with my closest friends who I feel we've done a lot of work together, we'll watch each other of like, ooh, what happened just there? Like we were having a perfectly connected moment and then something closed off. And that doesn't have to mean you did something wrong or I did something wrong. We're just willing to feel it of like, hey, I just felt something close. Is that something we want to talk about now or not? It doesn't really matter. So I think that honesty is a part of that vulnerability. And again, it has to be self-centered for most 90% of the work in the Gene Keys or in any transformational work has to be self-inquiry. And then there's a healthy percentage of listening to once I've found some ground and orientation, it is perfectly necessary to ask and be in that inquiry with each other. Because again, then we bring something new out of each other of like, oh, you're right. That did happen, and I missed that, and I get to bring that into our intimacy together.
You can learn more about Elijah at fractaldoors.com and on Instagram at fractaldoors. And if you're interested in the Gene Keys, check out genekeys.com.